Were you alive in the 1970s? I was. Did you survive the 1970s? If you were, I didn't. Well, I did, but I didn't. I'll explain. But the 1970s, I can see a lot of similarities between the 70s and today. The 1970s were a horrible decade for myself. And that 10-year span of my life was not a happy time for me, most of it. I struggled, and it was the decade that introduced me to say, welcome to struggling, because you're going to struggle for the rest of your life. And it was the decade that awakened me to realize that I was one of the slow kids. I could not keep up with normal learning patterns of normal people. I just couldn't do it. And my struggles began. What I can tell you that I remember about the 1970s was mostly that, struggling and working through school. I was always working. There was always a lot of things going on back then, but most of the time I was so busy going to school and working at whatever restaurant or grocery store I was in, took up all my time. In my spare time, I would hang out with the kids in the neighborhood and play basketball whenever I could. Because I loved basketball, I just couldn't play it very good. But I loved it. And the 70s were, of course, a time before technology. It was a time when there was no cell phones, no personal computers in your house, no flat screen TVs, none of this stuff. No digital stuff, at all, hardly. But it's also when things started to change. Now, in my last video, I made a video about the 1960s where I went strictly by my own memory. And as a kid, as you can see, my memory is not that great. I was corrected a few places, and I mentioned that President Nixon started the most favorable nation with China back in the 60s, and someone corrected me that was actually in the early 70s. So I looked it up, and it was actually not even Nixon. Nixon can be kind of credited for being the guy who started the dialogue. He's the one who started talking about bringing China in as an ally, as a friend, as a business partner. But the most favored nation was actually started later, I think, by, and I didn't write this down, I should have, but it was started by maybe Jimmy Carter, I'm not sure. But that was started actually in the 70s. So that's a correction I'm trying to make on here. But the 1970s were a turbulent time for the country. It was a turbulent time for myself. I wrote down some highlights from the 70s that maybe some of you remember if you're my age. If you guys are younger, you weren't alive back then, or your parents were. These were some of the major things going on in that decade, and I wrote them down. I just jotted down some notes. One of the major things in the 1970s was 1975. That's when the Vietnam War ended, and it was a mess. If you remember how the Afghanistan withdrawal, how the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, well, if you go back and look at the Vietnam War and how we left Vietnam, it was almost the same. It was almost a replay of that. The Afghanistan thing looked almost like Vietnam exit. We left a bunch of our equipment and junk over there, and we exited, and it was a big quagmire. I remember it on TV back then. The next thing I jotted down was in 1974. This has to do with Nixon. The Watergate scandal hit, And it was a big hubbub about the Republicans bugged the Democratic National Committee's headquarters offices with their bugs, and they were spying on them and doing all this kind of thing. And it trailed, the paper trail went all the way back to Nixon. And Nixon, unless I'm mistaken, I don't think Biden resigned. He just kind of handed things over to Kamala at the end of his term. But Nixon, I think, is the first and only president in office to resign from office. You guys can correct me on that. But he ended up quitting because of the Watergate thing. The other thing was, in 1972, women's rights, the Equal Rights Amendment came out, the Title IX and all that stuff. So women were fighting for equality in the workplace and claiming they could do the same jobs that men were doing. And so you ladies can chime in about that. The next thing is in 1973 and 1979, the country went through stagflation. That's high inflation and high unemployment. Plus, there was an oil embargo by the OPEC nations of the Middle East, and there were gas lines a couple of times that decade where gas was just not available. And people would line up, you'd see cars lined up half mile around the city blocks at every gas station trying to get gas. I vaguely remember that. It did happen a couple of times, 73 and 79. Television got a little bit more adult in the 1970s. We went from kind of entertainment and pop stuff, innocent stuff, to things like, trying to remember some of them, the sitcoms. The sitcoms came out back then. Two of the big ones I remember were Good Times with, now I can't remember my names. What's the guy's name? Jimmy Walker.
Somebody mugged my buckets.
And then All in the Family with Archie Bunker. I can't remember the actor's name. Carol O'Connor.
How do you want to pick on him when you just had such a nice surprise?
And the guy who played his son, Meathead, slips my memory right now. But those kind of sitcoms came out back then when, racial tensions were still pretty high back then. And those two sitcoms kind of tackled some of it. I remember that. Another highlight of the 70s was the tech of the day in the 1970s. VCRs came out back then, video cassette recorders. And microwave ovens came out in the 1970s. Also, the first ever video games were put out by a company called Atari. Another thing that came out in the 1970s was blockbuster movies. Movies went from just storytelling to big kind of spectacle things that we see now. One of the big ones was in 1975. Jaws came out.
All right, come on.
And I remember going to that movie. It scared the crap out of me a couple of times. That is one of the most iconic movies I think that's ever come out. With Quint and all those guys on the boat, and they're trying to catch this giant shark, and you've got that iconic music, when they're in trouble, and it's dun 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 dun. That was one of the all-time movies that came out back then. Another huge one that came out back then, 1977, Star Wars came out back then. That was a humongous thing to come out. As you can tell from then, it's been out in several iterations since, and it just keeps going. 1970s were still kind of the hippie-ish kind of thing going on until 1977 and beyond, when the disco craze hit. And for me personally, I hated it. I was still into rock and roll. I wasn't ready for all this disco stuff. I remember when that stuff came out and all the girls wanted to go dancing, and I was like, you know, I was like, man, this isn't real music. This is, you know, it took me a long time to kind of warm up to that kind of music. I was one of these characters that likes all kinds of music, but when that came out, I was just like, it was just like nails on a chalkboard to me. I was like, what is this? And then when Saturday Night Fever came out and John Travolta and all that
Tony, how's it going? All right?
Bee Gees stuff, I was just like, oh, please, give me a break. I just didn't, but that just shows you how kind of slow I was. I wasn't ready for the changes. There was a lot of changes happening back then, and I just wasn't ready for them. I certainly wasn't ready for that. Also, that same year, in January of 1977, this is a huge one. This probably defines that decade more than anything else, maybe, is an 8-night miniseries that came out on ABC in January of 77, and it was called Roots. Alex Haley's Roots. And it had over 130 million viewers. And at that time, that was the most viewership of a television show in history at that point.
Kunta Kinte.
It was huge because the country was still having racial problems and racial tensions, and you could tell things were trying to get better. People were trying to come together, and that miniseries was a huge impact. And that took TV to another level. TV kind of grew up back in the 70s. TV kind of lost its virginity, so to speak, because it went from just telling stories and nice little entertainment things to really tackling what was going on in the country and tackling adult issues. So a lot of turmoil, a lot of things going on in the 1970s, and it was another decade before all this digital technology was out. Now, I remember another movie that came out, I think, in 1979. This was a big one also. I remember it was directed by this guy named Walter Hill, and the actor's name...
What you doing?
I'm trying to remember the main actor guy in this movie, but the movie was called Warriors.
Warriors!
And it was also kind of a classic now.
I'm out to play.
If you look back on it now, you think, oh man, the technology and the special effects were horrible, and it was just awful. But to me, it was one of the movies that set the tone for the next decade. In '79, this movie, I remember when this movie came out, it actually caused fights and shootings and stabbings in many of the theaters that it was released in, because it was a movie about a gang of young people
What you doing?
stuck in New York City, a part of New York City where they weren't from, and they basically, throughout the night, had to fight their way back through all these other gangs that had wrongly blamed them for a leader's murder. So they had to fight their way home to make it back to Coney Island. It was a movie that kind of further made things grow up a little bit, because it highlighted the gang problem in New York City.
Feel good.
And it was a serious thing when fights broke out and shootings and stabbings in the theaters, because it just was one of those controversial movies. I remember those type of things from the 1970s. Otherwise, I was just a kid growing up, trying to find my way, and didn't know what else to do but work and go to school. That's all I knew how to do. And that's all I ended up doing the rest of my life, is working for other people. And it's not a life you want to have your kids walk into. But I'll talk about that on another video. Those were the highlights of the 1970s, and you can see how things have changed, and you can see how some things are kind of the same. But the 1970s were, 60s were the civil rights movement stuff going on. The 70s were just kind of a wake-up call, slap in your face, put it on TV kind of decade. But anyway, that's the highlights of the 1970s. And do the best you can with what you've got, wherever you're at. And I'll talk to you on the next one.